This is Devin with Writing Daily. Thanks so much for being here. We are going to be talking about switching gears. I know that may not make a lot of sense right now, but basically we're talking about things that we do that are sort of very usual in our writing. We kind of do it organically, and it's something that we kind of go through over and over again. So anyway, we're going to talk more about that in a moment. Just for introduction's sake, my name is Devin Galladay, the editor-in-chief of In the Know Traveler, and I'm also the author of the forthcoming book, 10,000 Miles with My Dead Father's Ashes. So just a heads up, I didn't do an episode yesterday. It was Mother's Day, and I wanted to spend the day with my mother. So we went out and had, some horrible, what is that? Smorgasbord, where they just have like 700 things under a heat lamp. My mother loves that. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Bruce, welcome. And so there you have it. But we had great conversation. We had a good time, and I am a lucky guy. So I wish my mother many happy blessings, and all the moms out there, because we wouldn't be here without them. Ray, welcome. So what are we talking about today when we're talking about switching gears in your writing? We're talking about little things we do. And I think really the stuff that I'm talking about today is probably good for like third draft and later. Like this is after you've kind of worked on your stuff a lot. I'm not offering these tips so you write down one sentence and then you analyze the one sentence using these ideas. Like, don't do that. You don't want to do that. It's going to waste your time. It's painful, and don't do that. So when I'm talking about switching gears, we're talking about kind of doing the things that we naturally, organically do. Like one of the things that comes to mind, I'm going to give an example what a friend of mine does, because she is so incredibly talented. And one thing that I do that is, talent or not, is something that I need to address. And I think these are some of the tips that are going to be useful. So one of the things that I have worked with a friend who is, by the way, a spectacular writer and a poet. She is, how do I describe her writing? Her writing tends to get very flowery. It's very condensed. It's dense, because what she's attempting to do, and this is what I think what poets do. And by the way, if you are with us, please consider hitting the like button. That helps us get seen, and it also lets me know that I'm heading on the right direction. Oh, hey, Bruce, good to see you. Yes, it is great to be alive. And Robert, thank you for joining us. So the poetic thing for me is that what we're doing is we're taking words and we're sort of like making a reduction sauce out of them to really kind of grind down this essence of what we're trying to share. Right? And we're doing it through language. And I think when it's done well, and I've given certainly some examples here, we end up with beauty. We end up with something that's very powerful, and it's hard to do. I'm not good at it. But my point is that my friend is very good at it. So what ends up happening is she takes this sort of like flowery, poetic license with her writing, and it becomes very sort of, shall we say, very lofty, very high end. So it's a very emotionally impactful set of writing. And I think if you're writing a shorter piece of writing, that's appropriate. But if you're writing long form, that high octane energy that's connected to the writing can be wearing and tiring on your readers. So when we're talking about switching gears in this particular instance, and we're talking about specifically sort of like the poetic, flowery, more dense word choice language when we write, we want to be able to allow not only for our writing to kind of come down from that, but we want to give our readers a break. And I think that's really what we're talking about switching gears here, is being mindful of the fact that if you've just given your reader a ton of information, lots of like flowery imagery, something that's really strong, we want them to be able to kind of step back a little bit and appreciate what you have done. And if they keep powering through sort of like this poetic prose on their own, and they're unaware of what's happening to them, they'll grow tired and they'll close your book. And that's what we don't want them to happen. And so I think there's these ups and downs that we use within writing that I think are crucial to make your writing more readable and digestible, I think might be the word that I would kind of want to use. So if you write in a very poetic way, just realize that once you've made like this grand statement, that you kind of back off from it. And when I say back off, we're not talking about pages and pages. We're just talking to back off, sort of like ease off the gas and get into another kind of format. It might just be like, here's my poetic exposition, and now, oh, and there's a dog on the corner, right? So whatever new information gets entered in, your reader doesn't have to constantly be thinking and trying to play catch up with your wonderful writing. And by the way, I think it's wonderful, and I think we experiment with it, but I think anytime we go in one direction and sit there, it makes it more challenging for the reader to make sure that, because we want them ultimately to follow to the next page. That's what we want. We want them to turn to the next page. We want them to finish the article. We want them to complete this. And again, most of the tips that I'm talking about here are more for, shall we say, long form writing. I think it's for books and, book length writing, novels, for nonfiction, etc. So my next tip would be about sentence length. I think by and large, writing shorter sentences is probably a good thing overall, but I think most of us, and certainly the people who submit articles to me, tend to have lots of 20 and 25, 30-word sentences in a row. And I think this falls into the same category of the poetry, is that you are, every time there's a period, you're sort of giving your reader a little miniature break, a little break in the action, right? And I think that's good stuff. And so if you're writing 20, 30-word sentences, one right on top of the other, I'm going to personally question, and this is something that when I see other writers do, it's something that may be, for me, something why I will accept versus not accept an article to appear on In the Know Traveler. So what I try to focus on is trying to break up the thing. And this is, again, something in my own writing, because I tend to be long-winded, in case you haven't figured that out. So it's really important for me to kind of get to the point quickly. And I think you can have varying sentence lengths that are still powerful and meaningful. As a matter of fact, Hemingway does this really well, where he tends to write shorter sentences, but if he writes a longer sentence, especially something that, the woman walked through the door filled with insults and cast harpoons at poor Larry sitting in the chair, and his, clearly, and it just keeps going on. And then when we finally turn our attention to Larry sat there. And so it's that kind of dichotomy of sort of like this long flowing sentence versus this short punchy thing. We're going to talk more about that in an upcoming episode, but the idea here is if you write solely short sentences or you write solely long sentences, I think, again, when you're talking about cleanup drafts, like, maybe your fourth or fifth draft, it's the kind of thing that you get to go back and say, okay, I'm going to break up this longer sentence just so I keep giving my readers breaks of information where they don't have to feel that they are inundated by too much stuff. Okay, here's something that I do, and this is something I have to be conscious of, is that we switch gears when we have too much dialogue. I would love for you to believe, first off, I think I write pretty good dialogue, but I think when you are writing dialogue, I think it's important to kind of put breaks in the action, because I would want to just have 4 or 5 pages of Larry talking to Susan, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it becomes like 2 ping pong talking heads. So we can have a scene where it's largely dialogue, but I think we need to fill in little nuances that break up the dialogue, so it's not just ping-ponging back and forth. As an example, Larry talks to Susan, Susan talks to Larry, Larry talks to Susan, Susan talks to Larry, and then we at least acknowledge that maybe Susan puts out a cigarette in the ashtray or flicks it across the street, or that Larry shuffles nervously in his seat. So we're not just kind of hanging on their words that tend to, in my humble opinion, kind of fall into a little bit of a vacuum. Like if dialogue just keeps going on for too long, I think it's easy, and this is true of anything. Like if we're just giving pages and pages of description, we probably want to kind of be mindful of the fact that that's kind of hard on our readers to absorb all of these details, and trust the readers that they can kind of, if you give them 2 or 3 important details, that they're going to be able to paint the rest of the scene with their imagination. So I think with dialogue, we need to kind of break things up. All of these points that I'm doing right now, we're going to bring into sort of like, I'm going to go into more detail on each of them at some point in the future. But so we break up our dialogue. And finally, we break up intensity levels, meaning we want to switch gears. So let's say we are writing a crime drama and there's lots of crime. And if it's crime on top of crime, on top of crime, and on top of crime, it's, again, this falls into the draining your reader sort of sensibility. Howard, good to see you. Elizabeth, welcome. And by the way, always make sure you consider hitting the like button and ask questions that are right in this corner, because I love to hear from you and it lets me know whether I'm on the right track. So we break up the intensity level. This kind of is very much akin to sort of like the poetic license notion. Samson, good to see you, my friend. And so what we do with that poetic license is the same way that we kind of consciously say, okay, we just had our desperado kill 25 people in a row, and maybe we need to kind of like get somebody caught up in the story of why this person is doing this stuff. But if it's just murder, 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 and gunfire, 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 I think that's fine for the movies. But you have to remember, when we're watching a movie, we're talking, you know, an hour and a half, 2.5 hours worth of movie. And by the way, what do we see? My wife and I went and saw the latest Avengers movie. It's basically 2.5 hours of nonstop explosions and shootings and stuff. And it's kind of fine. I mean, it's a movie and I expect it to be a very visually based, action-packed kind of thing. After all, I'm seeing a superhero film. And even that, knowing that going in, I was like, at the end of it, A, I wasn't a big fan of the film. And B, I was like, it was tiring. Like I was ready for a nap. So just keep that in mind, that if there is this sort of like consistency to it, and by the way, the opposite is also true. Like I remember Jim Jarmusch, a lot of people loved him because he would set up a camera and let 2 people pace in front of it and not say anything or do anything for 40 minutes, and they loved it. I was not that guy. And I think if you are just setting scenes and talking about the cracks in the sidewalks for a couple pages, you may want to throw in some dialogue. You may want to throw in some other things so it's not just cracks on the sidewalk. You want to, you know, either bring down the intensity level or raise it up so that, again, we get into things like what's at stake for the characters so we can love them, we can follow them, that we want to turn pages with them and find out their plight or their joy or their rewards and successes. Anyway, so just to go back to what we talked about again today, we are talking about being aware of mixing it up when we're talking about our poetic license in our actual writing, when we are talking about sentence length in our writing, when we are going with dialogue that deserves a little bit of a break in the action, so we give our readers a chance to read and see us. And then finally, on our intensity levels of what we are delivering in terms of either too much or too little intensity to our writers. Anyway, as always, please ask questions. Hit the like button. It would make my day brighter. And as always, writing daily, it's our thing. So I'm going to be back here again tomorrow talking about a new thing that will help us be better writers. Thanks for joining me.